Hi viewers, today I'm going to talk about API facade pattern that we see in enterprises. Before understanding what API facade pattern is, let's understand what APIs are and how APIs have become an important factor in digital transformation that enterprises undertake today. Today, digital transformation is a buzzword that we hear every now and then. It means the adoption of deep digital technology to efficiently solve complex business problems and to perform business operations to strategically grow businesses. APIs, or in other words, application programming interfaces, have become a crucial element in achieving digital transformation. That's because API is a methodology for interprocess communication between different systems, regardless of its implementation. Let's first understand the English definition of the word facade. Facade means a deceptive outward appearance. It is the phase of a complex setup of something. Facades are everywhere. Let's take a couple of examples. If we take a vehicle as an example, the outward controls such as the steering wheel, the brake, the gears of a vehicle is a facade for a complex machinery that makes the vehicle move. A similar example can be drawn out of computer terminals. Computer terminals have keyboards, touchpads, mouse. Those are a facade for a complex interconnection of wires that underpins a working computer setup. We can even take an example of a retail store as a facade. It can be a facade for a warehouse that may be located behind a store. Think about selecting a t shirt or a sneaker in a retail store compared to a warehouse. Obviously, selecting a t shirt would be quite easier in a retail store rather than in a warehouse. We can even take an example of a facade in the programming context. You may have used classes, libraries where there are methods and functions. A method or a function is a facade for a complex operations that method is actually performing underneath. A client or another program that is making use of that particular function doesn't need to know about those individual operations that happens underneath that facade function. So that function hides the complexity of its operations, so it becomes a facade. What is an API facade? API, as I mentioned previously, is an interprocess communication methodology to make different systems communicate. So APIs are the glue that connects different systems. And you would agree with me that APIs have already become the product of 21st century. That's because that's the way that different systems communicate, different systems expose the important data and so forth. API facade pattern dictates a thin layer of API interface for a complex service, just like the other examples that I mentioned previously. API facade may front complex service APIs or proxy APIs. So we'll look into these in upcoming slides with more concrete examples and so forth. And API facades usually provides a business API because these API will be consumed by other applications. So those will be business APIs and will also be easy to use than other service level APIs that may sit behind the scenes. Let's look at API facade patterns in enterprises today. There are different ways to realize API facade pattern. So we'll look into couple of options in this particular video. In a typical digital enterprise, there are heterogeneous systems such as database management systems, file systems, messaging solutions, maybe an ERP, and so forth. These are complex systems that have important data. API Facade can be realized as a single layer that fronts these different systems, which means API Facade layer will expose a business level API for a consumer application to retrieve important data that sits in these heterogeneous systems. Take an example of fetching some data out of a database management system. How those data are fetched is not of a concern to the consuming application. The consuming application only needs an interface that is easy to use to get the data it needs. The API facade layer can facilitate that. So in this particular pattern, the API facade layer is realized as a single layer, where that single layer will expose an interface and will also perform other complex operations such as fetching data out of database management system using SQL, and may also be doing transformations, doing some formatting and so forth. Those operations will all be baked into one single layer. So this is one pattern. But if we take real world examples, we also see sometimes what we call as service APIs, which perform some business logic. These service APIs sit quite closer to those heterogeneous backend systems and fetch details out of databases, put data in a file system, fetch data or reads files from file systems, put messages into a messaging solution, read another data from ERP, aggregate all those data, do some complex transformation. So these are called service level APIs or service APIs, which perform business logic. It is not ideal to expose these APIs to consumer applications or other applications which needs access to these data. One reason that it's not suitable is because service APIs have complex operations, and it might also have implementation level details even in the API level. So that's where the API facade layer helps the service APIs. API facade layer can sit on top of service level APIs for other applications to consume and make use of the important data that service API is exposing. Usually, the API facade layer is realized in the real world as an API gateway. API gateway will be the entry point for other applications to call APIs to fetch important data and make use of operations that is exposed in the API facade layer. The API facade layer, in this case the API gateway, will delegate those calls to the service APIs, which performs the other operations, the complex operations, which in turns will call the backend systems to fetch data. And then it will hand it back to the API facade layer, which will present it to the calling application. So this is another way that we realize the API facade pattern in the enterprise. We can even introduce another layer, an integration layer, or we also call that a mediation layer, that sits quite closer to the backend systems or other heterogeneous systems. So in this pattern, the mediation layer will communicate with those heterogeneous systems, because usually the mediation layer is realized as an enterprise service bus or an integration solution, which are specialized products that can communicate over different protocols and have all the building blocks to perform complex orchestration between different services and systems. It also have first class support for message transformations, message enrichment, message routing, and so forth. So usually the mediation layer will sit in between different systems and communicate over different protocols. It will also communicate with service APIs, which comprises of business logic. The mediation layer will expose what we call as proxy APIs. Those proxy APIs are realized as REST APIs or SOAP services or some other form of service. But these proxy APIs are usually unmanaged APIs. To make these APIs as useful for applications, an API facade layer is important. The API facade layer, as mentioned previously, is usually realized as a gateway. So the gateway sits in front of the mediation layer. The same flow as I described for service level APIs applies to mediation proxy APIs as well. The applications will call the facade API that the API gateway fronts, and the API gateway will forward that API request to the mediation layer. The mediation layer will perform other complex operations, will call service APIs, which performs business logic, and then present the response that it processed to the API gateway layer, which will then present it to the applications. API gateways are not just runtimes that facade APIs. Usually, API gateways perform more than just facading APIs. It usually also performs authentication, authorization, as well as other API governance activities such as rate limiting and also having policies to deny certain requests from certain IP ranges and so forth. So, this is another pattern. Finally, we can see another pattern of API gateway which will facade APIs and the integration layer and service APIs kind of combine together as units, and different such APIs and API facades together with the relevant service APIs with the integration proxy APIs all grouped each into different specialized units in a distributed way. So this pattern is becoming very popular today because it's more ideal for a container native application or a cloud native application. So that's because it makes the entire development, deployment, and distribution quite easier and scalable as well as agile. So this pattern also brings into another concern that in today's context, APIs and integrations are converging, meaning those two different systems can be one runtime, just as what the first pattern was looking into, the first single layer where the API gateway does API facading as well as other complex operations. So in a distributed setup, that kind of one single runtime is also becoming popular these days. So these are the different types of facade patterns that we see in enterprises today. There may be other patterns as well. So if you come across some of the patterns and you see those patterns are more prevalent in use today, uh, please also mention those things in the comments. I will see you in another post like this in near future. Thank you very much for listening to this. Have a great day.